Funding for this program was made possible by the members of WQED and the Allegheny Regional Asset District. Thank you.
The deadliest war in history. A battle between good and evil. And for African Americans, the battles raged at home as well as overseas.
Once we got to New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, we were separated. And it was the beginning of some very trying times if you happen to be a black member of the military.
Your own servicemen were at the bottom of this sort of totem pole of race in terms of the American military. So yes, captured Nazi military personnel had greater rights in American society than even African Americans.
Even though they were fighting two battles, one in Europe, World War II, the entire world is at war. So much is at stake. Plus, they're fighting for their dignity, their respect, their civil rights.
By most accounts, World War II was the most lethal conflict in human history. By the time the U.S. responded in 1941, much of the world was at war. However, when America called, its citizens answered. 16 million Americans served the United States Armed Forces, and as in most wars in our history, African Americans from Pennsylvania were there.
There were approximately 1.2 million African Americans who served on the home front and overseas in World War II, in all branches of the military, as well as women who served in Army Corps, Army nurses, and Navy as well. One of the things to remember is that in World War II, we had a segregated military. And most African American men, those who weren't part of the fighting forces, there was still a large contingent of the men who were in what we would call today support services, who drove the trucks, who delivered the goods.
The Fighting 92nd, all Negro Division, never has a dull moment.
Sam Black's research says that in almost every war in which America has been involved, there was a tremendous debate in the black community over whether African Americans should fight.
World War I was a major debate because the 20th century was really, if you look at it, it was the first century without slavery. And there were still people who were former slaves walking the earth. And they had some really tough feelings, not only about enslavement, but post-enslavement.
Laws legitimizing segregation and second-class citizenship of black Americans carried over into World War I and eventually into World War II. However, black advocates like W.E.B. Du Bois argued, let's fight and show that we are committed to democracy, and we will deal with the civil rights issues later.
We know that A. Philip Randolph was threatening a march on Washington in 1941 for civil rights. So there were a number of African Americans who felt they weren't on the side of Nazi Germany, but they weren't on the side of the U.S. and their allies either.
By 1941, blacks began to see some changes in American society and its armed forces with the appointment of Benjamin O. Davis Sr., the first African American to be elevated to the rank of brigadier general in the U.S. military.
The Pittsburgh Courier, again, because it's the greatest example of the press impacting the thinking of the masses in the black community. And the press was for the war, but also for civil rights. And the Double V campaign, of course, is the greatest example of that, coming out of the Courier and picked up by other black weekly newspapers. So that debate still went on about whether to fight, whether America deserved black fighting men.
Despite the racist policies of their own government, African Americans from all walks of life joined in the war effort. Many saw it as a necessary step in the march for equality and a chance for a better life after the war. Contrary to the belief that blacks were unfit for combat, hundreds of thousands of African Americans bravely risked their lives fighting for their country. The 5th Armored Group, a segregated unit made up of the 758th, 784th, and the famed 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, fought during the Battle of the Bulge. Doris Dury Miller served as a messman on the USS West Virginia when it was attacked by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Miller grabbed an anti-aircraft gun and defended the wounded ship. He was awarded the Navy Cross. Then there was the 320th Barrage Balloon Unit, the only all-black group to storm Utah and Omaha beaches during the D-Day invasion. Barrage balloons were large helium-filled vessels designed to defend ground targets against enemy aircraft. And among the men who hit the beach was young Henry Parham. Today he lives in Pittsburgh with his wife, Ethel Perry Parham.
The boat couldn't go but so far, and then the gate opened up and everyone just started to walk, and the bullets were flying all over.
Well, the purpose of the balloon was to keep protection, and we were never scrapped by enemy planes, so they kept them above us all the time. We protected with that.
So I understand that the boat didn't get all the way to the shore and you had to kind of wade ashore. Is that true?
That's right, up to our necks.
Tell me about that.
Well, it wasn't pleasant, I tell you that.
Paratroopers landed in Normandy behind the coastal defenses. Landings made with
D-Day, June 6, 1944, was a turning point in the Second World War. A combined force of 156,000 American, British, and Canadian fighters landed on a 50-mile stretch of France's Normandy coast, including the 320th. And when you finally got to land, what was your first order of business? What did you do?
Well, I guess to take cover best you could. It wasn't a pleasant thing to do, but we did it. However, and God bless us, we were able to do it.
In the summer of 2019, Mr. Parham and others who served during World War II were honored at a special gala given by the Veterans Breakfast Club.
And with your presence, we kind of reach back in history, but we also reach out to each other, I think, as citizens and kind of remind ourselves what our country is all about. Tonight, we're marking the 75th anniversary of 1944, which was an important turning point in World War II with D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, by honoring 55 World War II veterans who are with us tonight.
Often the black veterans' contribution was overlooked. What can you tell us about those veterans?
The black vets I've talked to often say, you know, I don't really want to commemorate that time in my life because it was a hard time. It was hard fighting two wars at the same time, you know, one against our enemy and then the other at home. I mean, they served in defense of this country for the flag, and I think they remind us about what values our country were built on, and I think they connect us to each other as citizens, and I think they connect us to the past.
Of course I'm proud. I know he had a very difficult time. People are a little more educated now than they were. Years ago, people was, I think, a little ignorant about different things. We are all one and the same. We all have a heartbeat. We all have red blood. We may be brown, blue, green, whatever color, but we all have the same goals, no matter who you are.
Surviving member of his battalion, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African American unit to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Many blacks in uniform are relegated to service positions. One of the most significant contributions blacks made during World War II was through a group known as the Tuskegee Airmen.
The 99th United States Fighter Squadron, attached to the 8th Army, is composed entirely of Negro pilots. Veterans of 236 missions in Africa, the Mediterranean, and Italy, men of the 99th have a brilliant record.
Elaine Efford is an award-winning radio news reporter whose father, Vernell Leaphart, was a mechanic with the Airmen.
My dad was a crew chief. He was in the 301st Squadron of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was part of the first graduating class because they did extensive training. In fact, it got to the point where they thought they would never see battle because they kept being trained and trained and trained.
Western Pennsylvania had over 95 men who served as pilots and ground crew members for the Airmen. They included Wendell Freeland, who later became a noted Pittsburgh attorney, Robert Higginbotham, who went on to a career as a physician, and his brother Mitchell, who is buried at the site of the Tuskegee Monument near Pittsburgh.
His remains were brought back here, and he is the first airman to be buried at the memorial.
J. Scott Went is the president of Sewickley Cemetery. He presided over the construction of the Tuskegee Airmen Memorial.
I think the Tuskegee Airmen set the initial example for African Americans to be able, they could learn to fly, they could learn to do anything anybody else could do.
We really are proud that we were able to put that together, that we were able to work together and build this monument to these great men. I remember my father saying that, you know, each engine, even though they're all the same, they have a sound, and you know the sound of your engine.
William Hicks is deceased now, but in this interview from the WQED documentary Fly Boys, he recounted what it was like to wait on his pilot's return from a dangerous mission.
We tried to protect them in every way. We took pride in that, and I tell you, it really makes you feel good to see one of those planes go out to the target and come back, and you know who made it all the way. Boy, that was something, I'm telling you.
There was an enormous amount of pride, so much so that one of my father's pictures, on the back of it he wrote, "This is not my plane. It looks like my plane, but this is not my plane." But the guy with the camera would not take a picture of my plane. I had to take a picture in front of his plane. This is not my plane. So I'm thinking, well, what difference did it make? Well, it made a lot of difference to them because it's what they worked on and they took ownership.
What was it like to send the men out and wait until they come back? I tell you the truth, sometimes it was kind of agonizing. I wonder if I did this right. Boy, what if he doesn't come back? And you sit there and you wait until you hear that roaring, ooh, coming over the hill. You know they're back.
Regis Babanas, a retired journalist turned historian, spearheaded the effort to build the monument.
15,000 sorties, 1,500 combat missions, 400 and some planes downed. One of their number strafed a destroyer and destroyed that. They had a brilliant battle record.
Mr. Babanas picked the site in Sewickley Cemetery for the memorial and got some pretty important people to make it a reality.
Mr. John Diagardi, president of Roe Monument, has made a major contribution because he has provided all of the stone and the lettering work for this memorial and provided it up front to everybody without any cost to him at the beginning.
There were skilled craftsmen who created the monument, complete with the signature red tail of the P-51 Mustangs they flew.
I think it's important to keep the story of the Tuskegee Airmen front and center so that our kids know who they are, where they come from, and to continue this legacy. But it takes strength of character. Look at what they were up against. People telling them, oh, you can't do it. that you're cowards, that you lack the intellect, constantly putting you down. And all they said was, give us a chance, we'll show you.
J. Howard Miller's iconic poster of a female war worker symbolized the strength of women on the home front. Industries were in dire need of skilled labor when most men were away in service. America's black women were ready, with an estimated 600,000 in the labor force during the war years.
A lot of you have your Rose of the River scarves on?
You had to wear pants and you had to wear a scarf around your head, and you'd have your lunchbox, and you'd go through the gate, and 11 o'clock you'd come out.
Ms. Althea Skelton was a real live Rosie who worked for Boeing from 1943 to 46.
I was born and raised and schooled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I graduated from Shinley High School in June of 1943. I got married in August. My husband went to Great Lakes for basic training in the Navy. In November 1943, I went to Washington, D.C. and worked for the Maritime Commission. When my husband finished his basic training, he came to Washington and said, "I'm taking you back to Seattle." So I quit my job. Before the war, there weren't that many blacks in Seattle, but they recruited people from all over to come up there to work in the shipyards and Boeing aircraft. I asked for clerical work because that's what I did in Washington, D.C. I was a clerk typist, but they didn't give us those positions. So I had to take what they wanted to give me. They gave me an electrician's job on the wing. I wired up the co-pilot side of the plane.
Mrs. Skelton and her friend Mary Alice were soon working as electricians on the B-29 Superfortress, one of the largest bombers in World War II. Still, many companies resisted hiring black workers for as long as possible, leading to bloody conflicts from Mobile, Alabama to Detroit.
Boeing had been segregated up until about 1940-41, the breakout of the war. How did you get along with your coworkers?
I was treated all right, but there were some people that had problems. They didn't want the blacks working there, but I never had any problems.
The union had a restrictive clause about hiring black people, didn't it?
That's right. Well, there were Filipinos, there were Chinese, there were Indians, there were Mexicans, but they couldn't belong to the union.
This was a tough time for black folks in America. What kept you going?
Well, I guess you knew you had to work. You needed to work, and you got a job, and you'd go on it and do the best you could.
After the war, Mrs. Skelton and Benny returned to Pittsburgh and civilian life until she received a mysterious phone call.
A friend of mine called me one day, and she says, "Boeing is looking for you." And I says, "Looking for me for what?" And they were having some sort of recognition for minorities because we couldn't belong to the union back then. So they flew me, my grandson, and my goddaughter, Rhonda, up to Seattle for the celebration.
When you look back on it, do you think that you broke ground and paved the way for other people?
Helped pave the way for other people to belong to unions, yeah. Helped pave the way.
American women played a major part in the country's defense, and black women were no exception. On the home front and at war, they were ready and willing to join the fight. Despite growing casualties, the Army didn't allow black nurses to enlist until 1941, and then assigned them to segregated hospitals. Undeterred, pioneers like Della Rainey Jackson became the first black nurse to be commissioned as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and Phyllis May Daly, the first African-American nurse sworn into the Navy. And in the China-Burma-India theater, there was Pittsburgh's own, the late, great Lily Lassane.
If you can imagine, in segregated America, first of all, to become a nurse, she had to go through segregated lines to even become a nurse. The difficulties for a black girl to grow up in Pittsburgh and not to be immediately accepted into the great university in their hometown to pursue her professional dream, then to serve in a segregated military.
I went to China Burma India Theater. They set up a hospital, station hospital, 335th Station Hospital, and that was an all African American hospital. All the personnel were Afro-Americans, officers and everyone. But in my commanding officer, we got all kinds of patients. He refused to have a segregated area, and he said, every patient who needed care in that area, white, black, would come to 335th Station Hospital. Another thing we insisted on, that we wouldn't take any rest leaves unless we could go where everyone else went. We refused to be segregated and go to other areas, so we broke that. We didn't have discrimination anymore. We could go where everybody else went.
When the war ended, there were approximately 500 African American nurses, less than 1% of Army Nurse Corps personnel. In 2015, Dr. Naja West became the Army's first black Surgeon General and the first black woman to hold the rank of Lieutenant General. Today, 7 decades after the desegregation order, African Americans make up to 17% of the Army Nurse Corps. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that African Americans had the bravery and intellect to become pilots, inspiring the country and a young Eugene Boyer Jr.
I served in World War II and Korea. I served a total of 8 years, 7 months, and 7 days.
Gene Boyer III is his son.
This is a story you were telling him about.
I was drafted into the Army the last year of World War II. I was excited about going to the military.
Mr. Boyer remembers firsthand what life was like in a segregated military.
We're all on the train from Philadelphia to New Cumberland, Pennsylvania. We were all integrated. Once we got to New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, we were separated. It was the beginning of some very trying times. The Army had decided that most of the officers who would command black troops would be Southerners because they had assumed that they knew how to handle us. And some of them handled us like we were the enemy.
Undaunted, the double standard only made him more determined.
I wanted to serve my country, and I liked being a soldier. The tougher it got, the better I liked it, because then you got a chance to demonstrate your capabilities.
In 1945, the war ended, and Mr. Boyer and thousands of men like him returned home. Then, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Those people who didn't want to comply and were difficult to deal with, the Army dealt with them and finally instructed them, if you don't want a problem, then you will go along with the program. Once it was integrated, it was amazing how fast we got to know each other.
When the Korean War broke out, Mr. Boyer re-enlisted, but not before he achieved his lifelong dream.
The first time I ever saw an airplane go over, I knew I wanted to fly My father never failed to inform me that little black boys didn't fly and never would. But my mother, she took me aside and she says, there's a God up there, and he's going to make some changes. And when the changes come, you be ready. So I got my pilot's license. And when I got it, I wrote my mother a letter. I said, dear Mom, this is to let you know that I've been learning to fly, and today I received my license. It was the greatest moment of my life.
What can we learn from your father's dedication and his commitment to making this country a better place?
I have a lot of hope for this country. I believe in this country, and I love this country. Even the things that I don't like, even the elected officials I don't agree with, we get to disagree, and nobody's coming in your house in the middle of the night and killing your family for it. So, it's still the greatest country in the world.
I believe most of us blacks who served in the military served feeling that if we show that we can serve as well as the other citizens and that we can make the sacrifices, then they are going to have to recognize the fact that we are as good a citizen as anyone else in this country.
I salute you for the service to the United States of America.
On March 29, 2007, President Bush, Congress, and former Secretary of State Colin Powell awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen.
The question is begged, why would we serve a nation that would not serve us?
That generation is considered the greatest generation. They dealt with the Depression, they dealt with World War II, that they accomplished so much. They put up with so much adversity and triumphed. And we've got to keep it going. We can only get better and better. We're standing on their shoulders.